The Garda, I suppose, one of their top targets, they have been described as the Drug and Organised Crime Bureau's top targets, are an operation called The Family, who are out of West Dublin. They would have initially been heroin dealers. In the last, certainly 10 years, they've grown at a phenomenal rate. They seem to be supplying everything at the moment. They have an MO in that they will sort of use and abuse local drug addicted people to store and stash their drugs and their weaponry. They are led by three brothers. They were subject to a massive sort of arrests earlier this year to do with a phone network called Ghost, and there's an ongoing overarching investigation into them and their operations. So they are the top targets. But interestingly, one of the key members of the grouping has been named through a Criminal Assets Bureau case.
Yeah, so this is a case taken against a number of people, but I suppose the primary target was Jamie Geoghegan, who from Shanecastle Drive in Clondalkin is where he's from, and it was mentioned that it was in that area where most of his drug dealing activity came from. But he's described as, a member of the family organised crime gang, and has been a direct associate of one of the leading members, one of the brothers that you're referring to. So, I mean, this guy is now 30. So this would have been started. It mentions that the investigation started. There was a profile done by a local cab profiler, as they call it, in 2021. So he was kind of flagged up at that point, for his drug activities. And there was another associate a year later that they also began a file on as well. And they carried out a search in his house in 2023. And in his particular house, they got stuff like, this is kind of going for the whatever cash and assets, luxury goods. Yeah. So I mean, there's a Rolex watch that was just over $5,000. There was some, I think, 4,000 in euros and 2,700 in sterling. They also targeted a Skoda Superb and a VW Golf that he was driving, and a modular home, which is actually a 3-bedroom modular home at the back of this house, which is actually his in-laws' house. So his partner is Charlene Craig, and it was her mother and father's house, Shanecastle, where this modular home was and where he lived as well. And so that was.
So they're living out the back, are they?
Yeah. And they found WhatsApp messages on a seized phone that suggested that he'd paid 33,000. But then the cab surveyor kind of brought that up to about 95,000 once everything was fitted in.
Yeah.
And it was also mentioned that was badly damaging an arson attack, which they put down to kind of feud violence in
the modular home.
In January 24. So nobody's, or they're not living in, the family aren't living in there anymore. For whatever reason, but the modular home was damaged in an arson attack, which they
Jamie
attributed to
Geoghegan's
feud.
in jail, yeah.
So Jamie Geoghegan has been in jail again since 2023, and that was over his arrest. And it was a really nasty abduction of a man who was then tortured. And again, it mentions in this affidavit, it wasn't mentioned in the trial, but it was mentioned in the cab affidavit that this was basically, he was suspected of stealing drugs that were connected to the family. And so this man, Jamie Geoghegan, was caught on a Ring camera or a CCTV camera or something like that, basically called to this guy's the house where he was staying in Ongar and dragged him from the front door and put him into a Land Cruiser. And then, so the reg of the Land Cruiser was noted or whatever, and the guards were looking to see if they could rescue this gentleman, and they spotted a known person that was a lookout. They got to this caravan in Fonthill Cottages, and Geoghegan was outside it. He took a runner at that stage, and they found this guy in his, I think in his boxer shorts. He was, tied with cable ties. He'd suffered a lot of injuries. He'd fractured in his shin, multiple fractures in his fingers. He's a broken wrist, multiple stab wounds on the backs and legs. They found claw hammer, machete, all this kind of stuff in the caravan, which they suspect were used as weapons. And so Jamie Geoghegan, in the Circuit Court last year, he pleaded guilty to false imprisonment and occasioning actual bodily harm, but he wasn't linked to the weapons. It was mentioned in court, and he got 6.5 years for that. So that he's serving time for that.
Right.
But he was also involved. He was one of a number of men also involved in chasing a teenage kid through St. Kevin's, chasing him into St. Kevin's College. And this is a young fella. They were armed with weapons. And again, it was mentioned in the affidavit, so it was over a suspected drug debt. And 6 months after this, case, the same young fellow was hit with a hammer and needed medical assistance. So, there's basically, they're involved in a lot of intimidation.
This is sort of terrorising communities, and you'd wonder, in relation to the victim in that first attack who was found in the caravan with all those injuries, had the Gardaí not had intelligence or whatever it was that he was being abducted or was abducted when they go looking, are these the kind of things that go under the radar because people are so afraid, or they're so afraid of the family, so afraid of these individuals that they don't report them?
Yeah, and he himself was quite in a similar situation, but in 2019 appeared in hospital with a minor shotgun wound. Him and one of his pals, Scott, I think it was Scott Perdue, who's also been convicted of kind of serious violence as well, who was also shot. And it was John Gilligan's nephew, Dylan Geoghegan, who was charged not with shooting him, but within possession of a weapon shortly after Scott Perdue was shot. And he's been shot. So Scott's been shot twice. And
there's feuding within that Clondalkin area.
Yeah, there's been ongoing for a number of years. And some like they think that the attack on the modular home was part of this, and again these various shootings, and again the point I suppose I was trying to make was that these all kind of went unreported to the guards as well, and that there were other reports of gunfire being, of shootings and so on, that they found on the WhatsApp phones that were seized, where they discuss it with others, and they say, well, that coincided with reports of gunshots in such and such an area on such a night. Nothing was ever reported to the guards. So a lot of this violence is going on that they don't know about it. But like one of the disturbing things was they talked about that he controls dealers, young dealers in the area, and some of them are age as young as 15. And they're very much kind of under his influence. I mean, even Perdue was described as being under the influence of Jamie Geoghegan, and that he often stays in Shandcastle Drive as well. He did. And that, despite his own family moving away from the area, he still stayed there. Mm-hmm. And is very much committed to this drug dealing gang.
So Gagan is operating a cell structure for the family grouping within his own community that he's living in.
Yeah, I mean that's a good way of describing it. And seem to be kind of living reasonably well for somebody who doesn't have an official job as such. But I mean the level of violence, I think, was the stuff that was kind of the most worrying.
Like what we're hearing about the Hennessy's, in relation to the Hennessy's, and some of the members of that family are going for trial in relation to a torture incident, of course, as well, that we've talked about on this podcast. Like that idea and that model of living within the community that you're terrorising means the community don't get a break at all from it.
No, and there's in relation to some of the other people as well. I mean, they're talking about kind of people being intimidated from their homes, people that were wrongly suspected of passing information to the guards having to leave the area and be rehoused by the local authorities, of arson attacks. This constant level of threat, and he himself, he's actually on, as it was put on, the divisional threat register, which means that there's a threat to his safety. So I mean, no matter where you are, if you're near him, either way, there's a danger of violence could break out.
And I wonder, why are we leaving it all to the guards in these cases? You have a possibility of that 3-bed modular home, which is big, and I can guarantee you that's too big for. You are allowed. Construct one of these modular buildings within a garden, but not a 3-bed home without planning permission. So where are the councils? We have in the case of the Hennessy's that the house which they were running essentially as their HQ is a council property.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, it's in a way, this is why the Criminal Assets Bureau was set up. I mean, you can't really expect civil servants, working for a county council to be able to handle these kind of characters.
But we have laws around evictions and stuff.
Yeah,
why
but
don't we enforce them?
Yeah, but I think you will need a kind of an approach that involves, the people with the guns as well, from the state side, you need to go in and serve all these papers, and it might well need a kind of a specialist kind of units to do this. And to some extent, the Criminal Assets Bureau are the perfect example in that they have, their revenue officers attached and people from social welfare attached to them, and they're all granted anonymity. None of them are mentioned ever in any of these affidavits because they're civilians, and it's a big ask to ask a civilian, worker to go and serve summonses on people like the Hennessy's or Jamie Geoghegan. But you
utilise every agency of the state that you have against these people, in particular when they're living in a community they're terrorising. And a lot of them are living in, I don't know about Jamie Geoghegan now, or the peculiarities of his living conditions. The modular home obviously was bought at some point and put in a garden, but like there are planning laws and there are council laws and ways of evicting people. You're not just asking them to go and do it on their own, but it's a multifaceted approach to these criminal gangs, especially these ones that are becoming so powerful.
But it's also a slow approach. I mean, like these things can take a long time to wind their way through the system. Like, there's an eviction notice or whatever. And then if someone's challenging it or looking for judicial reviews, and you're guaranteed that people with an organised criminal background aren't going to just simply roll over. Now, having said that, Jamie Geoghegan, didn't contest this case. Like he was actually brought to court from prison last week and just said, I won't be contesting this when he was asked. And then after all that the affidavit evidence was referred to in court, he was asked did he have anything to say to this, and he just said no. And that was it. And none of the other people that were mentioned, and some of these people would have been like, for instance, his partner and her sister, who had, say, cars registered in their names and stuff like that, and their mother as well. Would have been mentioned simply because
respondents on
they were mentioned as respondents, but in a sense they were mentioned as respondents because the other, the likes of Jamie Geoghegan was seen as the person in control of these assets. Like I think one of there was another gentleman who was listed as well, and he was the registered owner of a car that he was never seen parked outside his house until Gagan went into custody, and that was the first time the car was ended up outside his house in a different part of Dublin. But otherwise, it was clearly, he was always being clocked by the guards or collated by the guards as driving this particular car, and they knew that the VW Golf and the Skoda Superb were totally in his control.
Now, Jamie Geoghegan didn't probably start out in life, headed this direction. He was a promising footballer and he represented Ireland at underage level at one point.
Yeah, that was mentioned in his circuit court case last year, where, he, after pleading guilty to the false imprisonment and assault causing harm, and it was mentioned that he had played soccer underage, he'd been a promising footballer, and that he also played in the Homeless World Cup team as well. So... And there was actually, I think there was. Was
there any evidence about what happened? How did he?
No, we didn't hear anything about that. But like in the cab stuff, like certainly, if you look, I think in some of the messages there was suggestions that there was donations to charity on occasion as well. In a sense that I think they were
through this footballing, maybe
not necessarily. No, it wasn't clear. I think it was like, I think that they were owed money back for something, and there was an option to donate it to charity or collect it, and they just opted for give it to charity.
Right. Okay.
So I mean, there is an element of
self-serving.
Well, I suppose.
Well, I mean, this was
some kind of charitable giving. It was
obviously evidence given.
I think if you look at his social media as well, you can see a little bit of that.
Right. It was obviously evidence given as part of his, hoping to get a shorter sentence, along with his guilty plea. But interesting as well, is it not, that you've got the criminal courts, and then you have the High Court where the Criminal Assets Bureau come in. The fact that he pleaded guilty in the criminal courts meant that very little evidence was heard. Other than during sentencing, there will be a kind of an overview of what happened given, and then he's able to give a little bit of reason why he shouldn't be going to prison, or he should get a smaller sentence. Sometimes,
and that's the job of their lawyers, is to do that, to present your client in the best possible light.
100%.
But the
Criminal Assets Bureau are able to go that step further and give us the detail that allows us to talk about him as being a member and his links to the mob known as the family.
Yeah, and I suppose an interesting part of this was the WhatsApp messages that were from the seized phones. And it shows a kind of a constant, there's constant references to possibly weapons and to drugs and who owes what money, and and there seems to be kind of money circulating between senior members of the gang, and it's it's everything from 1,500 to 100 grand. I mean, there's one particular, there's a whole bunch of
This is WhatsApp
interactions.
messaging.
These
This
are what,
outside the ghost
and people
encrypted.
people being introduced, and then, but there's even people from say Tipperary who are dealing with them, and there's one particular person who. Apparently, there was something. I think it was a debt or something like 17,000 or something at one point, and they were on kind of friendly terms. And this guy was asking, "Look, I have trouble getting money off this guy. Is there anything you can do to help me? Can I get a? It was intimated that, he was looking for a gun to frighten this guy and all the rest of it, and they seemed to be quite." Like dealing with, they're not as equals, but like, there was a kind of a clear line of communication, and then the chap in Tipperary disappears. But if you go look at some of the court reports, then you'll find that this chap in Tipperary was later convicted of making threats to people, and pointed out that he'd had a finger cut off with a garden shears. So, I mean, you can add the dots yourself there in one sense.
The sort of pain goes on down the line, and the debts. And I mean, that is one thing that any notorious mob and drug dealing operation cannot allow a debt go, because that is all that is what keeps them, holds them in a position of power. They have to chase each one of those through violence, through fear, through intimidation, or else somebody else comes along who knocks them off their pedestal. They're seen as weak, and so it's a vicious circle, all of it.
Yeah, and I mean, and like to some extent, you wonder how organized things are as well, because I mean, there's a constant, one person has a kilo of green and another person has a kilo of powder, and they're looking for this amount and that amount, and how much is this so and so, and people asking each other, how much do I owe you again, and all this kind of. So you're wondering about their bookkeeping skills as well. So I mean, debts, I'm sure, can become really big without you actually physically incurring them, if you know what I mean.
I think they can, and I think it's like,
and if you can't argue with someone,
every day is like a day at the races, because you're putting down money. Sometimes you're up, sometimes you're down. And when you're down, you're in big trouble, and you need to find it. No matter where you are on the rung, you owe somebody.
Yeah.
Unless you're the likes of, the Kinahans or the cartels.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
and
where it
if
stops,
you can't keep the money flowing in the right direction, you're going to get in trouble. So if there's a bottleneck, and it's your problem. And
the
and then you become the bottleneck, and you're the problem.
Through seizures, through people not getting paid for whatever reason, you can have a lot of chaos within the ladder, in the drug dealing ladder. You can have a lot of chaotic characters who, like for every which reason, money doesn't get paid back. Small amounts, the debts grow, the interest is huge. There's no bookkeepers there.
Yeah, as Brian Meehan said sometime in the late 90s to the guards, it's hard to get good staff. Right. They couldn't believe when he was having this open conversation about how much money they were making selling drugs at the time. Yeah. And I'd say that is a big issue for these guys. It's a big retail operation.
Yeah. And you see a 30-year-old guy currently in jail, 6.5 years for that horrific torture, but he's running a group of kids, some as young as 15, who are the next generation.
Yeah, but he was doing this like when he was in his early 20s. He was operating, I mean, like it goes back to, they're talking about stuff going on in 2019 and previous to that.
He's in it a long time himself.
Yeah, so I mean, he was kind of at the top of the gang, in when he was like early 20s, 22, 23. And there was one kind of line in it from one of the officers that he has become increasingly ruthless, is the way they put it. So, that he seems to have moved up a level or moved up a gear in their view.
Is that holding his position, or is that because there's more pressure coming on him to bring in more money as the greed kind of kicks in as well? Because I think with the family, they were always making a lot of money, even just stealing the heroin. But I think in the last 10 years, with the demise of the Kinahan stronghold here in Ireland, they have been one of the people that have moved into that vacuum. They're big suppliers, obviously, Tipperary. We don't know where else in the country, but we know that they had been supplying Cork in previous, Limerick, etc.
Yeah, well, he's supplying locally as well. I mean,
you have the big operation going upwards, north, up the East Coast, and then you have these other suppliers elsewhere in the country who are sending it, again, northwest.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in the CAB affidavits, I mean, they described the family as Ireland's biggest drugs gang. So, I mean, there's no doubt about that. And this guy is has the ear of somebody who has a seat on the board of this particular outfit.
Well, when you see all the various units coming together, you know that they're not only Ireland's biggest, but they're the most targeted. So, we could be talking about them in a few years' time as, in language like demise, dismantling, etc.
I've no doubt we'll be talking about them one way or another. That's for sure.
Okay, Eamon, thanks a million.
Always a pleasure, Nicola.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.